Christmas in a garage, the true Christmas spirit. Old George, as everyone called him, was sitting in the office of his garage. And on that Christmas Eve, as he was sitting in his service station, he was looking out the window watching it snow. Now, ever since his wife had passed away, old George hadn't been anywhere in years. And it wasn't that he didn't like Christmas, it's just that he couldn't find a reason to be celebrating. And as he was sitting there pondering, the door to the office opened up, and in walked a homeless man. Now, this man was wearing the most tattered pair of jeans that George had ever seen on an individual. And when he looked down at his sneakers, he realized that it was more duct tape than sneakers he was looking at. And the gentleman had on an old bomber jacket that looked like it come straight out of World War II and had went through at least 4 or 5 plane crashes and barely survived. And old George, he didn't say anything. He just told the man, come over and sit down by the fire. And the homeless man looked at him, and he's like, I see you're busy. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll be leaving. Now, old George looked at him, and he's like, son, you ain't going anywhere till you get something warm in your belly. So you just, sit down over here by the heater. And old George handed him an open-mouthed thermos that was full of hot soup. He said, son, it ain't much. It's just some homemade hot soup. He said, but it is tasty and it is filling. He says, and the kettle over there is hot. He says, make yourself some tea or some hot chocolate. You're not going anywhere till you get your belly full. About that time, the driveway bell dinged. Now, old George looked at him and he's like, I'll be back. You just sit here and eat and enjoy yourself. And old George went out. As he stepped out of the office door and everything, he looked, and there was an old Chevy sitting under the awning next to the gas pumps, and steam was rolling out from under the hood. And a young Hispanic man was there, and this young Hispanic man was in near panic. Senor, please, my wife, she's having the baby. It's her first baby. The car, it just quit. Senor, help us. Old George got him calmed down enough to get him to pop the hood on that old Chevy. And when he raised the hood, the steam was still just rolling. Old George took one look, and he looked at the young man. He said, son, you ain't going anywhere in this thing. And old George turned and started back toward the office door. Now, this young Hispanic man was in near panic again. Senor, por favor, help us. Old George just kept on walking. As he went in the door to the office, he immediately turned to his right, and he did 2 things. He grabbed the keys to his old wrecker, and he hit the door switch. And he fired that old wrecker up, and he drove it out there beside the car, and he helped the young man get his wife in the car. And he told him, he says, she's 4-wheel drive, son. She got good tires on her. You just take your time. The hospital's just down the road. Just get her there safely. We'll worry about everything else later. And the young man sped off. Old George was watching him as they sped off into the twilight. The snow still coming down. He turned around and he walked back in the office. And as he's coming in the door, he was speaking. He's like, he says, it's a good thing I gave him that old truck. It's got 6 new tires on it. It's 4-wheel drive. And that old car of hers, even if it hadn't blowed up, it wasn't going to go far in this snow because them tires are shot. And suddenly old George realized that he was speaking to nobody. The homeless gentleman was no longer there. Instead, sitting on the table was the open-mouthed thermos, which was empty, and a cup that it looked like somebody made tea in. And old George thought to himself, well, at least he got something warm in his belly before he had to go. And old George went out and got some towels and stuff out of the shop and walked out to that old car. He dried the wiring enough to get that old Chevy started, and it run pretty ragged. But he managed to get it into the service bay. And as soon as he got it in the service bay, he got to looking and realized that the top radiator hose had blown. And he got to looking, and he realized he had the right part in his parts room. He wasn't even going to have to jury rig anything. He's sitting there thinking, 5 days ago I ordered that hose and it was the wrong hose and I didn't have time to send it back and forgot to send it back. Well, I got a place to put it now. So old George, he put on the new heater hose, or the new top radiator hose. He turned around and he dried off all the wiring and everything. And when he hit the key, the old car fired up and run real good. As he was putting the hood down on it, he looked over and he realized that his wife's old Chevy was sitting over in the far bay, and it had 4 brand new tires on it he just put on the year before. And they would fit right on this old car. So he turned around and he started swapping the tires around. Well, just about the time he managed to finish swapping those tires around and everything, and it was just tightened down the last lug nut and got the hubcaps back on, he started hearing gunfire out in the parking lot. Now, old George, he went running back through the office door, and as he stepped outside, he saw the police car over at the far end of his parking lot. And when he got there, there was a young police officer laying there, moaning and groaning. He'd been shot in the left shoulder. And the young officer, his name was Chuck, and he's sitting there and he's like, "Please, sir, help me, help me." Old George managed to get the young man up, and he got to looking real close, looked at the car and looked around. He got the young man into the office. And that's when old George reached over on the counter. There was a lot of clean shop towels that had just been delivered that morning. And he grabbed that and some duct tape. And to keep the young man's mind occupied as he was trying to bandage the wound and stop the bleeding, because old George had been a medic in the Army, and he knew he had to get that bleeding stopped. So as he was bandaging that wound, he started talking to the young man, and he was joking around. He's like, "Son, you know, they say with enough duct tape you can fix anything." And old George kept his mind occupied, kept the young man's mind off of what was going on. About the time he finished getting his shoulder bandaged and everything, he looked at him and he said, "Son, I got to ask you." He said, "Did you call in before you got shot?" And the young officer looked at him and says, "Sir, I didn't have time. Why do you ask?" And old George looked at him and said, "Son, the bullet that hit you in the shoulder also took out your car radio, and your handheld busted when you hit the ground." He said, "And I hate to tell you this," he said, "but I don't have another vehicle here." He said, "And on top of that," he says, "the phone has been out since yesterday, and we don't have any cell phone service around here." And as old George just finished that statement, the door to the gas station burst open, and a young black man stepped into the office with a gun in his hand. And he looked at George, and he screamed at him, "Give me all your money, old man, or I'll blow your head off." Now, old George looked at this young man, and he realized that he'd never done anything like this before, because the young man's hand was shaking so bad. And old George just looked at him and said, "Son, calm down. Don't, just calm down." He says, "Things ain't that bad. Just calm down." And about that time, the officer started to reach for his gun. And old George looked at him and said, "Son, leave that hand cannon right where it is." He says, "There's already one too many of them things out in here." He says, "I got this." He looked at the young man and he's like, "Son, I don't know why you're doing this." He says, "But, you know, this ain't the answer." And the young man looked at him and screamed again, "Oh man," I said, "give me all your money or I'm going to blow your head off." Well, old George slowly reached into his pocket and he pulled out the $150 that he carried for making change when he was selling gas. And he started handing it to the young man. And just as he placed it in the young man's left hand, he reached out and slowly grabbed the pistol from the young man's right hand. And the young man, he was shaking so bad he just turned loose of the gun and he fell to his knees. And old George, he eased the pistol back to the officer. And the young man sitting there crying, tears on his face, "I ain't very good at this, am I? I don't know what to do. I lost my job. The rent's due. They repossessed my car this morning. And I was trying to get something for my wife and my little boy for Christmas." Old George just looked at him and was like, "Son, here. Get up off your knees. Here, sit in this chair." And old George started making him some tea, and he's talking to him, and he's like, son, I'm going to tell you something. We all get in a bit of a bind. The road gets a little rocky. Says, but trying to rob somebody with a gun, that ain't the answer. Said, coming in here like you did, that ain't the answer either. Says, you know, we're all human. We all make mistakes. That's part of being human. But you've got to remember something. You can get by with a whole lot of faith and a whole lot of prayer. Says, now, you just sit here and drink your tea and calm down. Well, as the young man took a sip of his tea, he looked over at the officer. He's like, I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to shoot you. I was scared. You come up on me so quick, and I was shaking so bad. The gun just went off. I didn't mean to shoot you. The young officer looked at the man, and he's like, son, hush, drink your tea. Well, while they were sitting there, all of a sudden, they could hear sirens in the distance, and they were getting louder and louder. And just about that time, they looked out the office window, and there come a police car skidding up, and an ambulance right behind it. Well, two officers jumped out of the car with their guns drawn, and they come in the office door. And the first one, he looked at the young officer, and he says, Chuck, you okay? Man, are you okay? Chuck looked at him and says, I'm about as good as a man can get who's been shot. And the second officer, he's sitting there eyeing the young black man. And he's like, all right, tell me, Chuck, who shot you? And the officer looked at him and he says, I don't know, but he dropped this gun right after he shot. He run off into the dark. And now old George, he looked at the young black man, and the young black man's looking at George. They both got puzzled expressions. And that second officer, he's looking real hard at that young black man. He's like, suddenly he turned to old George. He goes, this kid work for you? Old George says, yep, just hired him today. Says, there ain't nothing wrong with him. Well, they motioned, and the EMTs come in, and they looked at the wound, realized the bleeding was stopped, and they didn't want to start it again. So they left what George had done in place. And the funny thing was, you know, as they were putting him on the stretcher and everything, the young man leaned over to the officer, and he's like, sir, why? Why? And all the officer did was look at him and say, Merry Christmas, boy. Thank you, George. Appreciate it most kindly. Y'all have a Merry Christmas. And they started taking the officer out, loading him into the ambulance. The other two officers, they left out, following the ambulance to the hospital. Old George looked at the young man. He goes, son, you just got one doozy of a break right there. Says, that'll take care of part of your problems. The young man suddenly looked up at George, and he's like, tried to give him the money back. And old George just looked at him. He's like, son, you take that money and you use it to get yourself some Christmas dinner for your family and everything. And about that time, old George went around behind the counter, and he sat down at his desk, and he opened up the bottom desk drawer. And he reached in, and he pulled out a lock box. Then he pulled out an even bigger box that the lock box sat in. And he opened that lock box up, and he pulled out a ring box, and he handed it to the young black man. The young man opened that box up, and inside was the biggest diamond ring he'd ever saw. And he looked at George, and he's like, I can't take this. It means something to you. And George just looked at him and said, son, yeah, it does mean something to me. He says, but you know, now it's going to mean something to you and your wife. He says, and my Martha, she wouldn't mind. And then old George reached into the second box that he brought out, and he started bringing out toys that the oil company had left for him to sell, and he never got around to putting them up on the counter. He goes, here, son, here's something for your little boy while you says that'll take care of most of your problems. And the young man, he started to cry again, and he tried to give the money back a second time. Old George just looked at him. Son, you just take that. Like I said, you go buy yourself some Christmas dinner. He says, now I'll tell you where you can get it. He says, there's an old couple down the road, said just past the hospital, said they stay open late on Christmas Eve and everything because they know all their kids are grown and gone, and they know that some folks just don't get everything they need for the next day. Says, so they stay open. Said they'll be expecting you. Don't worry about it. They are always looking for somebody who's coming in late. And the young man finally looked back up at George, tears in his eyes. He's like, "Sir, if that job offer's still good, I can be here first thing in the morning." Old George looked at him and said, "Sorry, son, I ain't open on Christmas Day." The young man's face dropped. About that time, old George just smiled real big, and he said, "But you be here bright and early on the 26th to start work." The young man just suddenly beamed, smiling up at him. Old George said, "But your first chore, since this is your first day of work," he says, "there's an old Chevy out here in the garage." He says, "You take it on down to the hospital." He said, "There's a young Hispanic couple," says, "they probably have a baby by now." He says, "You give that young man the keys, you tell him old George said Merry Christmas, don't worry about anything. You get the keys to my wrecker from him, and then you take my wrecker on home and you drive it back here in the morning." The young man looked at old George. He didn't know what to say. Old George said, "Get out of here, son." He said, "It's getting late. You need to get going." He said, "Those folks at the store, they ain't going to stay all day." He said, "That store's just past the hospital." He says, "Everything's on the way for you to get home." And the young man left. And old George, he went out and he was shutting down the garage bays and locking everything down. And he come in getting ready to lock down, realizing it was almost midnight by now. And all of a sudden he realized the homeless man was back in the office. And old George was like, "Wait a minute, I didn't hear the doorbell ding." He's thinking to himself and everything. And he looked at him, he says, "How'd you get in here?" And the stranger looked at him and says, "I've been here all along." Says, "George," says, "why do you say you don't celebrate Christmas when you keep it all year long?" Old George just looked at him and he's like, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, George, think about this." He says, "You fed me when I was hungry and when I was cold." He says, "You helped that young officer." He says, "And you do know that young officer will go on and save many lives when he stops a terrorist attack." Old George is sitting there. He's like, "Well, I don't really celebrate Christmas. It just didn't have the same meaning after my Martha passed away." He says, "I couldn't see decorating a Christmas tree. Why waste a good pine like that? And anyway, making Christmas cookies wasn't the same without Martha. Look at me. Do I look like I need Christmas cookies?" And the stranger just looked at him and said, "George, like I said, you celebrate Christmas and you celebrate it all year long." He says, "Do you realize that young Hispanic couple you helped now have a beautiful baby girl? And she will grow up and be a famous surgeon who saves many lives." And I told you about the young man, the young officer. He says, "And that young man who just left out of here that you just give a job to," says, "he will make you a lot of money and he will not want to take anything for himself. And you will eventually adopt his whole family as your own." Says, and old George, he's sitting there and he's looking at him. He's like, "I don't know how you can know all this." And the homeless stranger looked at him and says, "George, trust me. I have an inside track on all this. And I can tell you when the time comes, you will be reunited with your Martha once again." Now, old George is really looking at him strange because this guy's heading for the door. And as the old George is watching, suddenly that old bomber jacket, those tattered jeans, those patched up sneakers with all the duct tape, suddenly turned into a flowing, glowing white robe. And a light just seemed to fill the room that George just couldn't understand at first. And then suddenly the man looked at George and he goes, "George, I'm on my way home." He says, "It's a special day. There's a big celebration planned for me because it's my birthday." Suddenly it dawned on old George who he's looking at. He fell to his knees and he said, "Happy birthday, Lord Jesus." Folks, we wish you all a Merry Christmas from here at Safe Haven Ministries and Safe Haven Student Center. Now, wipe your noses, swallow that lump in your throat, and enjoy this last song.